Hello everyone! I hope you're doing well and enjoying the last days of winter. Today I'm going to be talking about monuments and how they affect space, specifically taking a look at the monuments that are located in Bellingham. First, I'd like to begin by recognizing my positionality as a white queer woman of Norwegian descent. This affects how I interact with people, how I feel when I enter a space, what I notice, and how I am treated by others. And this also all affects the research that I see and how I interpret things as well. And I want to recognize this to practice reflexivity and just acknowledge that due to my positionality, I do not know what it's like to be an Indigenous person confronted by colonial monuments on land that was stolen from my community, and that my intent with recognizing my positionality is that it will help me take a step back and empathize with experiences that are different from my own. I'd also like to begin with asking this question, which says, how do monuments positively or negatively affect a space? This was the question I began with when I started to research monuments and their impact on space. And my first instinct was that to this question was that it depends on the person of how monuments affect you personally because of our different positionalities and the experiences that we hold to ourselves. I also found it important to define what is a monument, and I found that these three definitions from Oxford Languages really summed up what monuments seem to be referred to in research that I had been reading. So the first one says a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. And in this one I would also include places that have been named for other people. And then the next one says a statue or other structure placed by or over a grave in memory of the dead. And then the last is a building, structure, or site that is of historical importance or interest. And the reason I liked these definitions because it really seems that in the research that I found, the historical importance as well as the in memory of the dead seems to come up as important reasons that we need to think about how our monuments affect the spaces that we occupy. I've lived in Bellingham for about 5 years now, and these are some of the first monuments I started to think about when I was trying to remember what kind of monuments have I seen in the spaces around Bellingham. The first one here in this picture is the Roeder House, and I know that the name Roeder is from a family who settled here in Bellingham, and they're considered one of the first settlers, and they also represent the logging industry, I believe, and so this house kind of commemorates them. But what the house doesn't recognize also is that the Roeder family forced Indigenous communities off of the land while altering the environment extremely by not practicing any give and take with the environment and rather just taking and over extracting resources. The Roeder family is also remembered as being racist and exclusionary towards minorities as well. The next monument that I remember seeing is the one that is found at Zoonic Park, which we also discussed a little bit in class, but it's this statue of a person and who's meant to be a sailor, and the monument also has names of people who have been lost at sea. And as we discussed in class, a monument in this way, recognizing Indigenous people, reflects in the community that Indigenous people are only valued for their contributions towards colonization, as many Indigenous people didn't have any other choice other than joining the fishing and sailing industry to survive in a Western world that has already hurt them so much. So this monument here recognizes them, but only for their contributions towards this Western way of living, which is also another problematic aspect of monuments that we see in Bellingham. This last monument here is in Fairhaven, and it's just another monument that only reaches back as far as the first settlers in Bellingham, which we know that the history of this place is much longer, as there has been a very as there's been an indigenous community living here since time immemorial. This led me to the problem statement of the historic preservation of places in Bellingham supports a legacy of coloniality, suppressing indigenous placemaking. And this is also just from looking at other monuments in the area and kind of seeing how it seems like the history of Bellingham is reflected only in the settler history, and all of these monuments are seem to be deeply rooted in colonization. We see these problems of monuments focusing on colonial spaces and creating that narrative through monuments like we went over in the Roeder House at Zwanek Park, Maritime Heritage Park, and in names in like Lake Padden or Galbraith Mountain, which is also named after settlers. And there are some characteristics of these monuments that I found is recognizing colonial figures. Like I had said earlier, the Roeder home is dedicated to one of the first white settlers who stole land from the Lummi tribe and cut down most of the old-growth forest. Lake Padden is also named after settlers who began the logging industry. And then I also found that in many of the monuments in Bellingham, indigenous people are only recognized for their work towards colonization, which we see in Zwanek Park. In my approach to the research I did, I wanted to keep my positionality in mind, because as a white person, I know that this affects how I interact in these spaces, as well as that I wanted to find indigenous perspectives on how these colonial monuments change the spaces for indigenous communities. And one of the conversations that I found most helpful, it was a conversation between Dr. Katrina Phillips, Dr. Kate Bean, and Dr. Gabriel Spears-Rico. And from their discussion with each other, three of the main points I found was that monuments are built to take attention away from indigenous people and people of color, which we see from the lack of monuments that represent indigenous people and people of color in Bellingham, and that these monuments represent exclusionary histories. So the monuments we see in this area are often one perspective of a history, which relates back to how many of these monuments only recognize time starting as when the first settlers arrived, when in actuality this place has a rich history of culture of the indigenous communities who are still here today, not only a part of the past, but have been here since time immemorial. One of their other points was that figures depicted in monuments like Columbus, who is often depicted in monuments around the U.S., attempt to erase the much longer history of indigenous communities. This was two other sources that I found helpful in trying to step back from my positionality and see how these monuments affect space in general, as well as specifically for indigenous people. And this is an article by Carrie Binjo, who's discussing a monument that was recently taken down in Canada, reflecting a settler who was known for being racist and harmful towards the indigenous communities. And some of her main points included that monuments should represent the people of the area, and leaving out indigenous culture contributes to the erasure of these communities, as well as colonial monuments represent one linear Western point of view of a space while leaving out indigenous culture, and again, contributing to the erasure of these communities. And another resource I found by Husan Husu, a professor at University of California, had similar feelings that monuments change the way we see spaces by inscribing history onto the landscape. So a monument kind of changes the way we view the area and which histories we remember, as well. It also tells us which deaths that people mourn, which emphasizes the values of that space and community. So when there's only these settler and white monuments, it kind of emphasizes this white superiority, as well as like, this is the history and people that we value and remember. Some of the context that I found affecting these monuments and just the time of discussing the removal or changing these monuments is that after the murder of George Floyd, protests began to remove monuments of colonial figures that have perpetuated the suppression of people of color in the indigenous communities. And so that these protests have brought attention to how these monuments negatively impact space and are better off being removed. And since these protests began, there has been a spike in how many of these monuments are being removed. Bellingham's settler history of colonization and stealing and abusing resources, including fish, lumber, and coal, has also changed the context of monuments in this area, especially because land has been drastically changed due to these relationships that from settlers that are so much based on extraction and pulling out resources, which is very different from the Lemhi and Coast Salish people in this area who follow the 13 moon cycle and give each resource a time to recover, and they live much more reciprocally with the land than what we have seen in colonization, which drastically changed the landscape. I also found this resource interesting as well as helpful, just as it details all of the monuments that have been taken down during the George Floyd protests began, and there are pictures of each of them if you want to follow this link to their page. After taking the research that I found, applying to other monuments and other discussions with Indigenous members of how monuments impact space, and also examining Bellingham's monuments, I found that Bellingham's monuments commonly represent colonization. Most of Bellingham's monuments ignore any history that occurred before colonization. Bellingham's monuments tell the community that we mourn settler figures and contributions towards colonization, and that Bellingham has been built by extraction of resources and one-sided relationships, similar to how monuments tell one side of a story, which led me to my problem statement of the historic preservation of places in Bellingham supports a legacy of coloniality, suppressing Indigenous placemaking. Should the monuments stay, go, or change? I think the most important thing to recognize first is that the future of these monuments should be determined by the Indigenous community in this area so that the effects of colonization aren't perpetuated through not asking for the advice of the local communities who are mostly impacted and harmed by these monuments. I have heard the perspective that these monuments should stay as a reminder of what not to do or to avoid in the future, but I do think after reading about the discussions between Dr. Katrina Phillips and her colleagues that the negative impacts of these monuments on space outweigh the positive impacts of any sort of remembrance of these times. I think after reading the research from these Indigenous scholars as well as articles about the effects of monuments on space, I think I do see that Bellingham is faced with inequity, injustice, and environmental degradation, and that the root of these problems lead back to colonization, which created the class system and one-sided relationships with the environment that drastically changed the space and landscape, and that if Bellingham is going to restore the environment, relationships with Indigenous communities, and inequities, then the monuments need to change, as monuments show what is important to a community. The current monuments honor wealthy people who stole the land and hurt the environment, which perpetuates values of the class system and white superiority. Some paths forward include removing or altering current monuments to reflect Indigenous communities, as well as listening and responding to Indigenous groups about how to create monuments that encourage an Indigenous lens. White Swan Environmental is a group led by Shirley and Troy Olson, who are members of the Lemhi tribe. Their goal is to restore the environment using the practices that they have learned from following the 13 moon cycle and living reciprocally with the land. The photo of this monument here is located on the San Juan Islands and is a great example of how monuments can be created that positively reflect the space and the communities in the area and that reach past the history of coloniality. Another monument that is being built is a longhouse on Western's campus. Longhouses were used by the Lemhi and Coast Salish tribes as locations that they would travel to during the different moon cycles. Each longhouse represented a different resource that was utilized during that time, which was not only very supportive of this community, but also of the land itself. Thomas Huxley is where Huxley College receives its namesake from. He is also a person who contributed towards scientific research that was used for eugenics, which is a racist form of science that is also inaccurate. The college is currently determining whether the name should be changed, which is another step forward towards considering the words that we use every day, as well as how they impact the spaces that we occupy. Thank you for listening to my presentation and my discussion around monuments. Here are some of my sources I used for the PowerPoint, and the others are located in this bibliography. If you would like to take a look, I will attach a link to that as well.